Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The Medran Interstellar Medical Facility on Karev Station had been designed, according to its own promotional materials, to feel like a place of peace. Sierra Vaughn had been a patient here for 11 weeks and had developed, during that time, a detailed and private theory that whoever wrote the promotional materials had never actually been sick. The walls emitted a soft frequency of light that the intake documentation described as neurologically soothing, and which produced, in Sierra's experience, the specific sensation of being gently reminded, every few minutes, that you were in a place people came to receive bad news. The corridors were the color of early morning fog. The chairs in the common areas were precisely the wrong height for Valith physiology, a detail she had raised with 3 separate members of staff, all of whom had responded with an expression of such compassionate incomprehension that she had eventually stopped raising it and simply sat in them at an angle, like a person making a philosophical statement through posture. She had arrived on a Thursday. She remembered this because the intake coordinator, a Medran woman named Dav Porel, who wore her administrative authority the way some people wear a very large hat, had processed her admission with the brisk competence of someone who does difficult things so often they have ceased to register as difficult, and had told her, while entering the cascade progression data into the station's medical database, that the private chambers on the 4th floor had a view of the outer docking ring, and that the Thursday light cycle made it particularly visible. Sierra had thanked her and thought, I am being oriented to a view. She had thought, this is what they do when the other information is too large. She had taken the room on the 4th floor and had looked at the docking ring and had watched, on her first night, a freighter the size of a small city complete its docking sequence with the slow, enormous patience of something that has traveled a very long way and is not in a hurry to leave, and had found this, unexpectedly, a comfort. The cascade had been progressing for 14 months by the time she allowed herself to use that word for it. Progressing. Before that she had called it a fluctuation, then an irregularity, then a concern, cycling through the vocabulary of minimization with the dedication of a scientist who applies rigorous standards of evidence to everything except the data she would prefer not to confirm. The first sign had been the laughter, unexpected, sourceless, arriving during a staff meeting on atmospheric particulate data with the social timing of a fire alarm. She had excused herself. She had stood in the corridor outside the meeting room and laughed for approximately 40 seconds at nothing, and had then returned and explained that she had received a very amusing message, which was not true, and which her colleague Dr. James Ockafer had received with a nod that she had subsequently decided, on reflection, might have contained a degree of skepticism he had been polite enough not to voice. James was like that. He was, she had come to understand over 2 years of shared laboratory space, approximately 712 conversations, and more than one working lunch that had extended well past any reasonable definition of lunch. A person of considerable perceptiveness, who deployed that perceptiveness quietly. He noticed things. He did not always announce that he had noticed them. He had, for instance, never commented on the laughter, or on the 3 occasions during their 2nd year of collaboration when her hands had been unsteady enough that she had needed to recalibrate the sample tray twice, or on the day she had sat on the laboratory floor for several minutes, because the emotional system had produced a wave of concentrated joy so complete and so inappropriate to the circumstances. She had been reviewing nitrogen fixation rates at the time. That standing had seemed like an overclaim. He had simply sat down on the floor next to her, opened his own data tablet, and continued working, which was either a gesture of such precise and intuitive kindness that it defied adequate description, or evidence that human researchers simply had a different relationship to floor-based working environments than she had been led to believe. She had asked him once which it was. He had said, with the expression of a man selecting his words with care, A little of both, probably. Then he had made her a coffee, terrible, famously, catastrophically terrible. The kind of coffee that suggested the person making it had been given a description of coffee by someone who had never encountered it. And she had drunk it without complaint because there are people whose gestures you accept regardless of the execution. And she had known by then, without having yet admitted it to herself in so many words, that he was one of those people for her. This was the thought she was carrying when the fog-colored room on the 4th floor became, on the 43rd day of her admission, the room in which she would perform the confession of regrets. She had requested it herself. She had signed the documentation. She had lain very still in the adjusted light with her eyes closed and begun, as the ceremony required, with the small things, the unsent message, the unsubmitted paper, the argument from her 2nd year of academy that had never been resolved and never would be now. She had moved through them with the careful attention the ceremony deserved, and they had settled, as they were meant to, into something quieter than they had been. And then she reached the thing that was not small, and said his name to the empty room, and said what the empty room was supposed to take from her and carry nowhere, and said it with her eyes closed, and waited for the silence that should have answered. What answered was not silence. The voice came from the left corner of the room, near the environmental regulation panel, and it had the quality of something that had been held very carefully in reserve for a long time and had just been released. Sierra did not move. This was partly the trained stillness of a bailiff in the final stages of ceremony, and partly the more immediate stillness of a person whose central nervous system had just received information that did not parse. She said to the ceiling, in a voice she was pleased to find quite level, "This room was cleared." "It was," the voice agreed. "I was already in it." She turned her head. Her double irises adjusted to the corner's dimmer light with the quick, involuntary precision of a body doing its job regardless of what the rest of its owner is managing. And there he was. Dr. James Ockhaffer, sitting in the chair that protocol, tradition, and 3 separate sections of Medrin medical code had specified should be empty, with the expression of a man who has prepared for a number of possible versions of this moment, and has just discovered that none of them were the right one. On the floor beside him, 2 empty beverage containers, 1 data tablet, and what appeared to be, she was almost certain, a thermos. He was wearing the kind of clothing that suggests a person dressed in low light and some haste. His left hand was resting on his knee, and his index finger was tapping its unpatterned rhythm against his own leg, which told her, in the language she had spent 2 years learning without meaning to, that he was thinking very hard and feeling even harder and was doing both at the same time, which was, for him, a normal operating state. She said, "How did you get in here?" He said he had spoken to the night shift intake coordinator. He said the conversation had involved 40 credits, a degree of creative institutional self-presentation, and a certification he had invented in real time. The certification, he explained, was called Confessional Witness Specialist, which he had produced with sufficient confidence that the coordinator had attempted to look it up, and finding no record, had been told by James that it was a recent designation, still being indexed by the relevant databases. The coordinator had accepted this with the professional courtesy of someone who processes the desperate and the grieving on a nightly basis, and has developed, through long experience, a fairly wide threshold for unusual circumstances. James had been in the chair for 4 hours and 12 minutes by the station clock on the wall. The thermos, he confirmed when she looked at it, contained coffee. She looked at him for a long moment. Her secondary pulse, the one visible at the base of her throat, was doing something that an observer would have struggled to categorize clinically. She said, "You invented a certification." "On the spot," he said, with the tone of a man flagging a point of modest professional pride. "And they believed you. I was very confident about it." She said nothing. He appeared to interpret this correctly as a request to continue, because he straightened slightly in the chair and said, in the shift of register that she recognized as the transition from person who is embarrassed to person who has something important to say. I need you to listen to me. I know what this room is for. I know what tonight was for. And I have been sitting in that chair for 4 hours because I found something, and I was not going to let you. He stopped, recalibrated, and continued with a precision that suggested he had rehearsed this part more carefully than the rest. I was not going to let the night pass without telling you. He reached for the data tablet. Then, apparently reconsidering the order of operations, he reached instead for the thermos, poured something into its cap, and held it out toward her with the expression of a person offering what they have regardless of its adequacy. She looked at the thermos cap. She looked at him. She took it. The coffee was, as it had always been in 2 years of shared laboratory mornings, genuinely, impressively, almost instructively terrible. She drank it anyway. He began to talk. He had, he explained, been researching her condition for 6 weeks, which she had not known, using databases he technically did not have clearance for, which she was not surprised by, after noticing things he had not told her he was noticing, which she found she could not be entirely surprised by either. He had cross-referenced Valith cascade syndrome with every documented autoimmune condition in the Earth medical literature. All of it. The full catalog, working through it in the evenings after the laboratory closed, and on the 2 weekends she had been absent from the exchange attending pre-admission consultations that she had told him were faculty reviews, which he had, he said, not believed for a single moment. She said, I told you those were faculty reviews. He said, you told me they were on Thursdays. She waited, he said, you hate Thursdays, you've said so 11 times. You wouldn't schedule anything important on a Thursday if you had a choice. So they weren't optional. He looked at her steadily. I started looking the next morning. The fog-colored room held them both in its frequency-tuned light. Outside the window, the docking ring was completing its own slow rotations, freighters moving against the dark with the patient enormity of things that travel very far and do not stop. And inside the room something was happening that the room had not been designed for, something the architecture of careful release had no category for, which was a person who had come to say goodbye discovering. In the corner where the silence was supposed to live, that someone had been keeping watch in the dark. She set down the thermos cap. She said quietly, what did you find? And he picked up the data tablet, and his finger stopped its tapping, and he began. The paper had been published 11 years ago in the Journal of Interplanetary Immunological Research, which James pronounced with the reverence usually reserved for sacred texts, and Sira privately thought sounded like the kind of journal that arrived in your inbox, and you intended to read, and then didn't, for months, until the guilt became its own low-grade condition. The research team was based at the University of Sao Paulo, Earth, and their subject had been a cascade failure in the human secondary lymphatic system that bore, in its fundamental mechanism, a relationship to Valith cascade syndrome that James described as striking, and that Sira, reading over his shoulder now, would have described as arresting. The architecture of the failure was different. The trigger points were different. The species involved were, self-evidently, different. But the underlying logic of the collapse, the way the secondary system turned incrementally against itself, the cascade progression moving outward from the initiating site with that specific terrible patience she had been living inside for 14 months, was written in a language she recognized. She read the abstract twice. Then she read it a third time, which was not a thing she did with abstracts, as a rule being a person who reads quickly and retains thoroughly, and finds repetition professionally embarrassing. James watched her do this without comment, which was considerate. He had, she was noticing, arranged the tablets in a sequence, not randomly, not by date, but by argumentative logic, each document positioned to answer the question the previous one raised, which meant he had not simply found this material but had constructed a case from it, the way you build something you intend to be load-bearing. She said, still reading, the treatment protocol. He produced the second tablet with the timing of a person who has been waiting for precisely this question. The Sao Paulo team had developed an immunomodulatory course over 8 years of trials, refined it across 3 subsequent studies, and published outcomes that described, in the measured language of people who have learned to be careful about hope in print, significant stabilization in all documented cases and meaningful reversal of cascade damage in the majority of long-term patients. Significant, meaningful, the words of scientists who had watched something work and were being responsible about saying so. She looked up from the tablet. She said, "This has never been applied to a Valith patient." "No," James said, "because Valith cascade syndrome was classified terminal before this research existed, and the Medrin medical establishment," he paused, selecting his words with the care of a man navigating between honesty and diplomacy in a narrow corridor, "has a very strong and genuinely admirable tradition of accepting the limits of current knowledge." She said, "That is a very diplomatic way to say they stopped looking. I was trying to be respectful of the cultural framework." "And now," he said, "now I'm done being respectful of the cultural framework." He said it without heat, which made it considerably more convincing than if he'd said it with any. He had already, he continued, been in contact with 2 members of the Sao Paulo team, who were now affiliated with Earth's Interplanetary Medical Division, and who had reviewed the summary of her case that James had sent them, without her knowledge, without her consent, and with what she recognized as the specific ethical confidence of a person who has decided that asking forgiveness is more efficient than asking permission when the alternative is someone dying. She should have found this alarming. She found it, she would examine later, something more complicated than alarming. She said, "You sent them my case summary." "A redacted version." "How redacted?" He looked briefly to one side. "Your name and species were included." "James, they needed the species. The species is load-bearing information." She put down the second tablet and picked up the third, which contained the correspondence with the Sao Paulo researchers. They had written back within 6 hours, which for academic scientists was roughly equivalent to running, and their message had the particular energy of people encountering something that makes their previous work suddenly larger than they had understood it to be. They had questions. They had already preliminary thoughts. They wanted, if possible, full cascade staging data, secondary system imaging from at least the past 6 months, and a direct consultation at the earliest opportunity. One of them had added, in what appeared to be a personal note appended after the formal response, "We've wondered about cross-species application for years. We're very glad someone asked." Sierra read this and was quiet for a moment that had some weather in it. Outside, the docking ring continued its patient turning. The facility's night cycle was beginning its slow transition toward artificial dawn, the fog-colored walls shifting half a tone lighter in a way that was meant to signal morning gently, and instead always struck her as the building clearing its throat. She was sitting up fully now, which her body was noting with the low editorial commentary of a secondary system in consolidation phase that had opinions about posture but was, tonight, being overruled. She said, "You have been doing all of this for 6 weeks." "Approximately. While coming into the laboratory every day." "Yes, and making me that coffee." He looked at her. A small thing moved across his expression that she could not entirely name, though she had a candidate. He said, "The coffee is a separate matter." "Is it terrible on purpose? I have wondered for 2 years." He said with great seriousness, "I genuinely cannot tell any more. I think I may have lost the baseline." She laughed. It arrived the way her laughter had been arriving for 14 months. A half-second late, the emotional system running just behind the stimulus. But it arrived, and it was real, and it had in it the specific quality of a laugh that comes from the second heart rather than just the lungs, the kind that her culture would say means the feeling is true. He heard the difference. She could see that he heard it, in the way his own expression settled into something quieter and more certain, like a calculation that has just confirmed its result. She looked at the tablets arranged in their logical sequence on the bed beside her. The case he had built in the evenings while she had been preparing for a ceremony he had come, uninvited and uncertified, to interrupt. She thought about the 4 hours in the chair. She thought about the invented credentials and the 40 credits and the terrible coffee carried in a thermos to... She stopped in the doorway. She looked at Sira. Then she looked at James, who was sitting in the corner chair with the posture of a man held upright by the specific structural integrity of a person who has not slept and has decided, on some fundamental level, that sleep is a problem for a future version of himself. The empty thermos was on the floor. The tablets were arranged across the bed in their argumentative sequence. James had, at some point in the past hour, found a second bag that contained, among other things, 2 printed documents and what appeared to be a hand-annotated bibliography, the margins of which were dense with his cramped writing in a mixture of scientific notation and what Sira had concluded, reading the portions visible from her angle, were the notes of a person doing research that was not entirely professional in its motivation. Dr. Voss said carefully, "There is a man in your room." Sira said, "He has a certification." James opened his mouth. Sira looked at him. He closed it again. Dr. Voss set down her morning's documentation, picked up the first tablet that James held toward her with the solemnity of a person presenting evidence at a proceeding where the stakes are very high, and began to read. She read the way good physicians read, not skimming, not performing, but the real reading that means the mind is actually moving through the material and testing it against what it knows. She read the Sao Paulo paper. She read the outcomes data. She read the specialist correspondence, which by this point included a second message from the research team, sent at 2 in the morning Kharkiv station time, containing a more detailed preliminary assessment and a sentence near the end that said, "Based on the cascade staging data provided, we believe this patient is an excellent candidate for the modified protocol, and we would strongly recommend proceeding." They had underlined strongly, in a formal medical communication. Sira had read this at 3 in the morning and had felt the second heart do something so unambiguous that she'd had to breathe through it. Dr. Voss read for 22 minutes without speaking. James did not fill the silence, which was, Sira thought, one of the more significant acts of discipline she had witnessed from him, given that she knew from 2 years of close observation that his relationship to silence was approximately the same as her relationship to the wrong-height chairs, technically manageable, but requiring continuous active effort. He sat with his hands folded, and his index finger still, and watched Dr. Voss read, with the expression of someone watching a very important calculation complete itself. When Dr. Voss finished, she set the tablet down and was quiet for a moment that had considerable weight in it. Then she said, in the voice of a physician choosing intellectual honesty over institutional comfort, "We classified this condition terminal in the early period of Kharkiv relations, before this research program existed." She said it without defensiveness, which Sira recognized as a form of courage. "We have not revisited the classification because our outcomes data supported it, and there was no contradicting evidence in the literature we reviewed." She paused. "We did not review this literature," James said with careful restraint. "The journal is relatively specialized." Dr. Voss gave him a look that suggested she appreciated the restraint and was not entirely fooled by it. She said she would need to consult with her research team. She said 3 days. She suspended the managed decline protocol immediately and reclassified Sira's status to active observation, signing the documentation on the tablet she had brought with her with the decisive movement of someone who has made a decision and is not interested in the distance between deciding and acting. Then she looked at James one more time, with an expression Sira could not entirely read but which contained something that was not quite disapproval and not quite admiration, and lived somewhere in the specific territory between them. She said, "The confessional witness certification." James said, "Yes." She said, "It doesn't exist." He said, "No. She said, I'm going to need to speak to the intake coordinator. I understand. And you are going to need to write a formal apology to this facility. I have already started it, James said, with the tone of a man who had in fact already started it, which Sierra found so entirely characteristic that she had to look at the window for a moment. Dr. Voss left. The room rearranged itself around her absence into something quieter and different from what it had been at any point in the 11 weeks Sierra had occupied it, because it was no longer the room where she was waiting for one thing, and it had not yet become the room where she was waiting for another. And in the space between those two definitions, it was simply a room on the fourth floor of a facility on Karev Station, where two people sat in the early morning light and existed, which was, it turned out, enough. James said, she's going to make me write a very long apology letter. Sierra said, you violated 17 protocols. I counted 15. The certification was 2 on its own. He considered this. That's fair, he said. She looked at the docking ring through the window, where the first freighters of the morning shift were beginning their slow approach sequences, enormous and unhurried, traveling their incomprehensible distances with the patience of things that understand that arriving is a matter of continuing rather than rushing. She thought about the paper she was going to write, the comparative autoimmune study, the cross-species immunological analysis, the research that had been theoretical for 2 years and was now, with some irony, personally sourced. She thought about the laboratory at the exchange, the adjacent benches, the afternoon arguments about methodology that she had always privately enjoyed more than the methodology warranted. She thought about the ceremony she had prepared for, the words she had spoken to what she had believed was empty air, and the way that believing a thing completely does not, as it turns out, make it true. She said, the things I said last night. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of avoidance but the quiet of attention. Then he said, yes. She said, I said them to an empty room. I know. The room wasn't empty. No, he said, it wasn't. He looked at her with the directness he had always had, the quality she had noticed in the first week of their acquaintance and had been, ever since, in some negotiation with. It hasn't been empty for a while. I just wasn't sure I was allowed to say so. The second heart, which had been governing her feeling through 14 months of deterioration and one night of unexpected reversal, made its quiet assessment. She had spent 2 years building reasons why certain things were impractical, which is a very sophisticated way of being afraid, and she had spent one night saying the true thing to what she thought was silence, and had discovered that the silence had been listening all along, and had been, in its own way, trying to answer for much longer than she knew. She said, the coffee really is terrible. He said, I know, I've accepted it about myself. She said, when I am out of this facility, you are going to let me teach you. He said, that implies you think there's a correctable error somewhere in the process. She said, there are several. He smiled. It was the smile she had counted, without meaning to, across 2 years.